I will not go into the details of the presentation since they are shared on the program, but just to mention that we are going to have a bit of a change from what was advertised. So our first presentation is going to be by Suelen Emilia Castiblanco, and our second presentation is going to be by Bina Agarwal, and the other presentations follow as advertised in the program. And the way we're going to structure this session is after each presentation, we're going to allocate about 7 minutes for questions and answers. And I will be keeping track, as will the presenters, on the question and answer box, so that once the presentation is over, we then address the question. Once each presentation is over, we then address the questions and the issues raised in the question and answer box. So may I then invite Suelen Emilia Castiblanco, I beg your pardon, to make the first presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Abena. I'm going to share my slides. So I don't know if you can see them now. If you can, please confirm if you can see my slides.
Yes, we can. Yes, we
Thank
can.
you so much. Well, hello everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor for me to be in this panel. My presentation is about empowerment. So I have called it Social Structures plus Agency equals to Power with and to, a methodological proposal to approach to female coffee growers empowerment in Colombia. So to start, it is important to mention that there is not a consensus about what is the meaning of empowerment. I mean, you can see and listen to this word in many discourses, so, especially in international organizations discourses, but there is not a consensus about what empowerment means. Actually, you can make kind of difference in the definitions of empowerment before 1995 and after 1995. Why this date? Because in this date was promulgated the Beijing Platforms Action, and before this date, empowerment was more about transformative change and emancipation and liberation and this kind of social movements to change subordination structures. However, after 1995, the concept took a twist, a kind of change, and now, for example, Batriwala mentions that the concept is more about an individual concept to promote individual autonomy, and now this concept has to be with, it is more related to the exercise of individual agency and individual decision-making power and things like this, and it has lost a little bit its emancipator character and its liberator character. So now there is an excessive focus on assets and opportunity structures to promote empowerment. So for example, if you go to the UN Women webpage, you can see that most of the programs are really focused on how to expand the access of women to microcredits or to self-help groups or to self-employment programs and other kind of these interventions, but there are less interventions oriented to socio-cultural transformations or to political transformations. Then the evaluations that we see of empowerment programs are really oriented to economic participation, and most of them neglects other human development dimensions, even though they recognize the importance of these other human dimensions in the empowerment processes. So to summarize, we have a really economic focus on empowerment, and this can lead to misunderstandings on what empowerment means. So my question was, how could we have a more comprehensive understanding and measurement of female empowerment? And for answering this question, I have started like a kind of a program of research program that it has taken so long, and I hope it takes so much time, but well, these are my preliminary results. So first, I start to review how empowerment has been measured. I took as a departure point the work by Malhotra, Schuler, and Bender. They have worked, they review all the papers that have been published until 2002 about empowerment in different regions of the world. And then I kind of brought to the present this review, considering only quantitative impact evaluations. Then I am going to consider qualitative evaluations, but until here I just consider quantitative evaluations. So here you can see some of the results. In general, most of the evaluations are really focused on the individual and household sphere of decision making, and most of them relies on primary data in different regions, especially in Africa and in Asia. In Bangladesh and India are focused most of the works about empowerment. Well, when I reviewed this information, I found out that most of the evaluations of empowerment are oriented to study one indicator. I mean, they just focus on economic participation, or I mean, they evaluate the effects or the impacts of empowerment in individual indicators: economic participation, assets control, decision making inside the household, or well, these kind of indicators. But recently have been some efforts to start to construct indexes to measure empowerment. What is the point of this? That indexes can be more comprehensive, can include more items and more dimensions to evaluate. So this has been an improvement in empowerment evaluations. For example, we have the Fernandez Ewerling Super Index. I don't know if you have read it about it. It is published in Nature, I think Nature Journal, I'm not sure. And Susan Peak Esage Index, that is also really popular. But I focused on two kind of indexes. The indexes that are based on self-determination theory, that have been developed by Sabina Kire and other co-authors. And these indexes, they have developed two kind of indexes: the Relative Autonomy Index and the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. These are similar index because they focus in measuring empowerment as agency. So they understand empowerment as agency expansion, and they understand agency as the motivation to act. So if a person is intrinsically motivated to act, she is empowered. If a person is extrinsically motivated to act, she is disempowered. This is generally the theoretical model, and they have developed these two indexes to approach to this kind of agency as empowerment. And we have other kind of measurements that are based on Kabir's empowerment theory. I think that Kabir's empowerment definition is one of the most popular and well acknowledged definition of empowerment. And she has developed some measures to approach to empowerment based on her proposal of three components: resources, agency, and results. I chose to work with this kind of approximation. Now I'm going to show you what did I do. I'm sorry, I am having problems. Okay, here. So what happened? Well, the pros of these kind of approximations, they have, as I told you before, a more comprehensive assessment of empowerment because they include more elements. For example, if you see the one of Akire, you can see that she includes, for example, life meaningfulness, psychological needs, and life satisfaction. If you see the one of Kabir, she includes resources, and she includes several manifestations of agency. Also, these kind of indexes allow us to understand a relationship between empowerment and economic participation and actually human development. And finally, they come from different disciplines, different fields, for example, psychology, development theories, feminist economics, among others. However, what are the cons of these, or what do I think are the cons of these approaches? They have neglected the role of social structures in the decision-making process. In the definition, they include the role of social structures. However, in the test or in the instruments to measure empowerment, you don't see this element. They have a liberal view of autonomy because they are really focused on decision making, and they don't consider the exercises of, for example, power within or power with and to that are proposals for Rowlands in 1995. Then, so I propose, I'm sorry that I'm checking here how time I have. So here I propose this approach to empowerment. And I mentioned that we can talk about a conceptualization of empowerment that is composed for three elements. As I told you, I follow the path by Kabir, and we have structure, agency, and power with and to. So I understand the structure, taking the concept by Giddens, that are the rules and resources that give meaning to a social system. So we have resources, a set of capitals, and we have rules like cognitive frameworks that allow us to evaluate reality. We have agency, and here this is important because in opposition to agency as decision making, I understand agency as relational autonomy based on Mackenzie. And I understand that agency has to be a process that has to be like oriented by self-determination, so the freedom and opportunity to make decisions, by self-governance, that you can understand this like power within, I mean the self-affection, the self-control, how do you see to make decisions, and self-authorization as the capacity or the ability to be yourself as capable of exercising control and be accountable of what you do or the kind of decisions that you make. And I think that these two elements can lead to the exercise of power with two, like an ability to get into collective action to transform social structures. So as you can see here, we have a more a broader understanding of agency, not just as decision making, and we have results of empowerment as collective action. Well, so here is a definition that I propose to define empowerment, like a process of agency expansion that implies an understanding of social structures that intervene in the decision-making process and can lead to manifestations of power with two as a strategy to resist and challenge power over. Well, to validate this theoretical proposal, I conducted a cross-cultural adaptation and a validation of an instrument that is proposed by Kabir, Mahmoud, and Assa. It is called Building Citizenship and Promoting Participation. Here you can see the phases, but to summarize, we use an UNGov, we translated the instrument. We use an UNGov method with 5 judges, and we pilot the instrument with 6 women through cognitive interviews in Colombia. Well, we got this structure that is a structure of 68 items divided into 3 dimensions according to our theoretical proposal. And then we validate or we pilot this instrument with 251 women that came from 2 coffee locations in Colombia. In Colombia, we have 32 locations. In Spanish, we call them departamentos. And these 251 women came from this part of the country that are Tolima and Huila, which are the departamentos that have a long tradition, a long coffee production tradition. So that's why we chose those locations, and we use a non-probabilistic and intentional sampling. What did we find? We find an instrument that contains 26 items and 4 dimensions. Here you can see the psychometric results of the test. I'm to point out, we have a really good fit, and we have a really good Cronbach's alpha, or 0.73 in social sciences, it is considered like a good confiability, confiability result. And we found the evidence of 4 dimensions and not 3, as I have proposed initially in my theoretical approach. So we found evidence of 2 types of resources that shows the importance of evaluating more than economic participation. So we found evidence of 1 type of resources, competences, abilities, and capacities that are related with what women think they are capable of doing. For example, if they can recognize diseases in children, if they can help other members of their community, if they accompany people who request their help, and other kind of things like this. And we have other dimensions with economic resources specifically, like if they have ever asked for a loan, or if they are able to pay their fees, or if they have coffee card. Maybe later I can talk to you more about this coffee card. It is a really important thing in the coffee production in Colombia. We found a 3rd dimension, that is agency, and this is really interesting because we found evidence that agency is not just decision making, just as we have proposed in the theoretical approach. For example, here we found questions about making decisions: who made the decision to participate in the association, who makes the decision about investing. But as you can see, we also found evidence about other kind of elements in agency: self-determination, self-authorization, and self-governance. For example, here you find questions about recognition, about confidence to express positions, about the possibility or the ability to carry out plans, even when they have to argue with someone that is important for them to carry out these plans, and these kind of questions. And finally, we found evidence of 2 types of finally, we found evidence of results. And here also is interesting that our results are really focused on manifestations of power with and power to. For example, we have ability to defend themselves against violence, but also we have the ability to demand rights and fight for them, and also the ability to report and confront what seems socially unfair to them. So we have manifestations of power with and to as results of the empowerment process. Then, to conclude, we propose a theoretical and multidisciplinary approach. I didn't tell you, but the definition of empowerment came from review literature from philosophy, psychology, sociology, development theories, feminist economics. So it's a really theoretical approach. And this contemplates how social structures can intervene in the decision-making process and the exercise of agency. Also, we found evidence of 2 dimensions related to resources, and this is really important. We found evidence of the relational component of agency. If you pay attention to this, you can find that most of the items are related to the relationship between women and their families, their society, their communities. So there is a really relational component that is really important in empowerment. That seems to be the result of this analysis. However, we need to confirm these findings with the factorial confirmatory analysis. This is something that we have to work in. We didn't.
Well, you need to wind up, please.
Sorry, thank you. I'm gonna read this and I end. I'm sorry. We didn't find evidence on the role of gender beliefs. These gender stereotypes, we didn't find evidence, so it is important to contemplate this. And it is necessary for the research on manifestations of power with and to capture some of its cover manifestations. And here are some reference, and I'm really happy to share my slides in case you want them. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the
Thank you
time.
very much, Suelen. What has happened is you've eaten into the question and answer time.
No.
I don't see any questions and answers here, but please, if you have any questions, please type them into the question and answer box.
maybe we can go on in case our public is a little bit shy, maybe later.
Okay, so if we don't have any questions at this point, we may keep them till later. May I then invite Bina Agarwal to make her presentation.
I can't unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
But you can't see me. So
no, because you're sharing your slide, so you need to go to the first
have
slide.
you got, just one second, have you?
Now we are seeing your
You're seeing my slides, okay.
The last page, yes, so if you can start. Okay, so you may start now.
Okay, wonderful. So this, first of all, Happy New Year to everybody, to all the friends. Now, our paper is on which women own land in India, intergender and intragender gaps. Now, this is a joint paper with two young scholars, Pervesh, Anthwal and Malvika, Mahesh. And I would put it as in the interface of economics and law. Now, in 1994, I had published a book called A Field of One's Own, which covered 5 countries. And it catalyzed a large body of empirical work as data became available. Now, these provided further evidence on the book's arguments that if women owned land, it would improve theirs and their children's well-being, productive efficiency, decision-making autonomy, and so on. But much of this research was not on India, since India has not had all India data sets on land ownership by gender. More recently, however, several economists have tried another route to assess the impact of Indian women's property rights. And they do so by using amendments which were made to the 1956 Hindu inheritance law by 5 states in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, these economists treat the reforms as quasi-natural experiments, and they use econometric tools to capture the effects of an increase in a daughter's legal rights to property, on girls' education, on female suicides, on son preferences, and on women's likelihood of inheriting land. Now, their findings diverge. Some find a positive effect on girls' education. Others find no effect. Some find increased likelihood of daughters inheriting land, and others find no effect, and so on. And some include all 5 states which have amended the law, and others fewer. So apart from these inconsistent results, this approach raises several concerns. We do not know, for instance, if families are even aware of the exact amendment that was taking place. Can we assume that simply enacting a law changes people's behavior and attitudes, given long-standing parental resistance to daughters' claims to property, especially land? And most of the papers test the impact of strengthening women's legal rights as daughters. But daughters, of course, could legally inherit even before the amendments. So what the amendments did was they simply extended women's rights over joint family property, which households may or may not have. So the argument is that we need to go beyond the laws to measure actual ownership. You might ask, well, why is it important to look at inheritance law in determining women's access to land in India? Now, this is because although we can obtain land through the market via purchase or from the state via transfers, inheritance is the most important source, since 86% of agricultural land is privately owned and land markets are weak. So in the paper, what we argue is that conceptually, we need a clear understanding of India's complex inheritance laws to accurately design surveys and interpret the data. Secondly, that recent studies by economists on the effect of India's law reform fail to bring such a legal understanding to bear on their analysis. Also, that gender inequality in land ownership needs multiple indicators to get a handle on different aspects of inequality. Now, this has been argued in the African context by Cheryl Doss and others, but it has not been measured in the Indian context. And fourthly, that we need to measure both intergender inequalities, that is between women and men, and intragender inequalities among women, especially daughters and widows. Now, empirically, there are very few data sets for estimating how many women and which women own land in India. And we look at and assess that existing data sets are either restricted or flawed, and they enable computation only of one or two indicators of intergender inequalities. So what we've done in this paper is use ICRISAT longitudinal data for the first time for this purpose to compute multiple indicators of intergender inequality. And we also run logistical regressions to assess intragender inequality. So then what is, consider, for instance, what is India's inheritance laws? Now, these laws are extremely complex because they vary by religion, by region, and by type of property. So for our paper, the relevant law is the Hindu inheritance law, this one, and which covers 80% of Indians. And I will explain this briefly. Firstly, it's important to recognize that Hindu inheritance law has some very specific features. It distinguishes between a man's separate property, and in which there are a certain first category heirs, and there's joint family property, which is property which is held jointly as co-partnership shares, and these are rights by birth. Now, in a separate property, the son, the daughter, the mother, and the widow have equal shares if the man leaves no will. But in joint family property, only men had rights by birth under the 1956 Hindu Succession Act. And if the property was unpartitioned, then if the man died, then his notional share devolved equally on the son, daughter, and widow. So let me just give you an example. In this example, you have, in this example, you have a man who owns 90 acres. He has two sons, S1 and S2. And these shares as co-partnery are held equally by each branch of the family. So then he has 30 acres, son 1 30, and son 2 30, and son 1 has 30, but then he has a son with whom he shares equally, which is 15 acres each. Now, if S1 dies, then his share of the co-partnery, which is 15 acres, goes equally to his widow, his daughter, and his son. But the son, in addition, has his own direct rights by birth in the joint family property. So the son ends up with 20 acres, the widow ends up with 5, and the daughter ends up with 5. And therefore, you get these, you get inequalities. Sorry, I'm not able to move the slide. Okay. Now, in this, so what happened was that after 1956, 5 states amended this act, and one state, Kerala, abolished joint family property altogether, but the other 4 states brought in unmarried daughters as co-partners in joint family property. In various periods. And then in 2005, there was an All India amendment where all daughters were co-partners. Now, what does it mean to make a daughter a co-partner? So if you look at this diagram, you see the upper diagram is the same as what I had shown you before, but the lower one recognizes that there has been an amendment. And here what you see is that it's the same man with 90 acres. S1 has 30 acres, but he now shares it with his daughter and son. So both daughters and son are co-partners. They have 10 acres each. So if S1 dies, his share goes to all 3, the widow, the daughter, and son, 3.33 acres each. But now the daughter and son have more. They have 10 acres each of the co-partnership property and then 3.33 of the man's property. So they have equal shares, but the widow's share declines to 3.33, whereas earlier she had 5 acres. So then the question is that I think it's to move from these amendments to real life impact, we need to first demonstrate that families have joint family property, which may or may not, many may not have. And we need to distinguish between land received by daughters from the father's separate property under the 1956 Act, and that received from her own share in co-partnership property following the amendments. And there is no such distinction that is made in the papers or in the existing data. So let us see what the empirical evidence tells us, which is moving beyond the law. So here, there are 2 data sets which have been used earlier. These have limitations and flaws. I don't have time to go into them. And what we did, therefore, was used ICRISAT data. This is longitudinal data. It has some limitations, but its strengths are it's longitudinal. It follows the same set of households from 2010 to 14 for 30 villages in 9 states and 5 states for an additional year. And it covers states in the south, in west and central India, and in eastern India. And although this data set is widely used by development economists for other purposes, this is first one that looks at gender and land. Now, what we've done here is therefore use this data set, first of all, to measure 7 indicators. These indicators, as you can see from the slide, vary. And they measure different things. The first one, for instance, looks at the percentage of households with landowners of given gender. And it shows if landowning households have any female members. The second indicator gives us the gender gap in landowners. So if you take both male and female landowners, what % of them are women? The third looks at the proportion of women among women who own land. And then the fourth is pretty important because it looks at both individually and jointly owned plots. So if co-partnership rights were being recognized as under the law, you would expect a lot of joint ownership with siblings and fathers. And then the remaining indicators tell us how much land women own, what proportion of total land, and land quality. Other studies have only looked at 1 or 2 indicators, basically indicators 2 and 3. And here is the table, which gives you, I've put them all together because of lack of time. And as you can see, what is striking in this table is that irrespective of what the indicator is, the gender gap is extremely high. So barely 16% of landowning households have any female landowners. They own only 8.4% of women own land. Overall, women constitute only 14% of landowners, owning 11% of the land. Now, we know that we notice that South India does relatively better than other regions, but there is, and I'll come back to that difference. So even in 2014, that is 58 years after the Hindu Succession Act of 56 was passed, 20 years after the last state level amendment, and 9 years after the All India Amendment, few households have women owning land. And there's been very little change over the 5 or 6 years of this data. And across all the 9 states, only 2.3% of plots, you look at this, only a very small percentage of the, only 2.3% of the plots are jointly held. And this means there is rather little co-partnership property, but also that law amendments have not had much of an impact. So then we also did a logistical regression to probe the factors, the individual, the household, and regional factors, which can affect the likelihood of women owning land vis-a-vis men and vis-a-vis other women. And basically, we have 3 equations, where in equation 1, we have all the members in landowning households, and that is to measure the intergender gaps. And the equations 2 and 3 contain only women family members and male family members respectively to measure the intra-gender gaps. The dependent variable are dummies. If you're a member, you're a landowner, it's 1, 0 otherwise. And the exploratory variables basically include regions, The regions matter because of differences in social norms. We've included personal characteristics, the marital status, age, education, and caste of the person, and then household characteristics, which is total land owned and number of members. Now, I'm presenting only the marginal effects and some of the striking features. And what you can see is that in the first equation, you have the chances, which is on all the members. The probability of men owning land is 48 percentage points greater than of women owning land. If you take the female members, then there are two factors which are striking. Sorry, this is. The first is that location matters. So we find that women in Andhra Pradesh in South India are 12 percentage points more likely to own land relative to women in other states. But what's also striking is that none of the other reform states show this difference or much difference with non-reform reformed states. The second striking feature in these results is that if you're a widow, you're 22 percentage points more likely to own land than other women. And the state level variable is not significant for male members. And this reinforces the idea that cultural geographies that affect women's land ownership don't affect men. So they are as likely to own land irrespective of where they are based. For both genders, older people are more likely to be landowners, but not the more educated. And it appears that if you're a younger educated member, you don't want to farm, and that reduces your claims. Now, I want to say just a couple more points. One is, why do regions matter? And these are maps that I have made on the basis of ethnographies. They are part of my book, A Field of One's Own, and I share them here. And what is striking is that in southern India, that you have social norms which allow women to marry within the village and to marry close kin. And there also no female seclusion in an obvious way. And why this matters is that if you can marry within the village and within the extended family, families are less resistant to giving daughters land than in northern India, where you find that you cannot marry within the village or close kin, and there are social norms which seclude women and makes it more difficult for women to manage the land. The second thing which is important is that we find this finding that widows are the most likely, and older widows are the most likely to own land, is reinforced by findings in other studies, both micro studies and in macro studies. And we also historically, if you go back to the 11th, 12th century legal treatises, you find that widows had claims much more than daughters. So basically, I'll conclude by saying that although legal reform has strengthened daughters' rights, social practice continues to favor widows' claims. And this also means that economists who've been pegging their arguments on legal amendments that limitedly enhance daughters' rights might need to rethink their assumptions. For data collection, there are recommendations that land ownership, if you want to capture the complexity of the impinging factors, we really need to understand the complexity of inheritance laws in India. And the same would be true of the importance of recognizing these complexities in interpreting the data. So let me close with this.
Thank you very much, Bina. So we've got about 4 minutes for any questions. Again, I don't see any questions in the question and answer box. Please, if you do have any questions, if you can type them in.
Or if my co-panelists have any questions,
sure,
ask.
Yes. Otherwise, if there are no questions for now, we may go to our third presentation and then the questions. Okay, I see a question. And the question is from Caroline, and she's saying, thank you, Prof, for this presentation. How did caste configure into your work?
Well, in terms of caste, we found interestingly that we had 3 categories of caste: forward castes, other backward castes, and then scheduled castes, scheduled tribes. And we found that, in fact, among the forward castes, there was greater likelihood of women inheriting land than among the other backward castes. And the possibility is that many of the forward castes are not directly doing agriculture, whereas the other backward castes, the men are more directly involved in agriculture. But those are very much there in our results.
If I may ask a question to Bina, I was wondering if you have data on other outcomes that you could look at. For example, the mixed results you presented earlier by previous work. Is it possible to check on the same outcome variables to see if you find, because you're right, just having a legal change does not mean that you will see behavioral change. So I think it would be interesting to see what you...
There are, not from this data set, but I think there is great scope to move in the other direction. For instance, you have studies from on Africa and or even Bangladesh, which have data sets which enable you to directly measure rather than peg it on a change in law. What we have done is, it's a paper is still, I'm still finishing up, but we have the results, is to look at productivity differences. So if women actually do own land in those households where they're managers or not managers, does it make a difference to agricultural productivity? I mean, it's a particular data set which relates to peasant households. So you can move only thus far. But because it's longitudinal, I might mention, since I have a minute, that what we also did, because it moves from 2009 to 2014, that we took there is no qualitative data, but there were 183 landowners, women landowners. So we traced and looked at the profile of each woman across each year, and we could tell exactly which year she had become the owner. And that was the year when the husband had just died. So we could actually interpret qualitatively to say, yes, double check beyond the regressions, to say, she obtained the land when her husband died, because next year she's the owner. And the majority of cases, we found that it was widows who had, the women had got the land as widows, even when they were daughters or there were sons, unmarried sons in the household. So we thought this is very interesting. I might also add that in the old 12th, 11th century Mitaksha system, the men had first claims, 4 generations of men, then the widow, then the unmarried daughter, and then the married daughter. So the current reform is in the direction of giving all daughters rights, legal rights, but the social practice going back many centuries is to recognize the widow's claim. And because divorce is so limited in India, the assumption is that as a widow, the land will, she is wedded to the family as well, whereas daughters move out to other families. So I think those elements of social norms are very much there. We talk about it in the paper, not enough time to present it.
I'll have to cut in here. Thank you very much, Bina. And so we now move to the third presentation. So Ípek, Thomas.
Okay, thank you, Abena, and thank you everybody for coming this morning, or this evening, or whatever time it might be where you are. I'm presenting the first part of this, and then Ípek is going to pick up. This is a collaborative project where much of the work has been done by Ípek and Emel Memis from Istanbul Technical University and Ankara University, respectively. The rest of the work has been done by myself, by Kijong Kim, who's here as well, and by Ajit Zacharias, who couldn't be here. This is part of work for the Care Work in the Economy project, a part of the Rethinking Macroeconomics Working Group. What I want to do is first talk about the, the research agenda. So this is part of an ongoing research agenda that is looking at the returns to investing in social care in terms of employment, income, and poverty. And previous work has done policy simulations, macro employment and micro distributional effects through jobs, income, and poverty. Work on South Africa by Rania Antonopoulos and Kijong Kim, on the USA by Rania, Kijong, myself, and Ajit, and on Turkey by Ípek, Kijong, and Kaya. This, though, is going to look kind of bring together a couple different sides of this. So we want to explore an increase in fiscal spending on the social care versus alternative spending. For example, physical infrastructure, green energy, cash transfers, in terms of the short run and labor demand side outcomes, right? So that's been the previous work: employment creation, distribution of jobs, poverty reduction. And the findings generally have been that social care spending generates more jobs. Most of the jobs go to women, but there's also substantial job creation for men. The gender employment gap and gender earnings gap generally become more narrow. And there's a higher poverty reduction when you look at spending on social infrastructure versus physical infrastructure, et cetera. So another strand, another part of the piece of this project has been work that we've done at the Levy Institute on Ghana and Tanzania, which Abena has also been part of, that looks at the impact on time and income poverty as well. So that brings in another dimension, time. And so we'll see how that all works together. So just to kind of give an overview of looking at how you can assess the economic impact of investing in social care. You can look at the demand side and the supply side effects, right? So they're both there. While all these are outcomes that derive from investing in social care, some of them, only some of them we're going to be looking at in terms of this project. Demand side effects, specifically, of course, jobs generation is going to be one of the direct outcomes, which will lead to an increase in women's employment and a decrease in gender gaps in earnings and employment, right? And an increase in wage incomes for households in general, right, which is going to decrease income poverty and have some effect on time and income poverty as well. For the supply side, we look at, what we're looking at is the work constraints on women's labor force participation are going to be somewhat alleviated by the investment in social care, early childhood education. This should increase women's labor force participation and decrease time poverty, right? But the outcome on time poverty is kind of up in the air because more time spent on income generating activities, less time spent on household production, but the balance is questionable and so has to be examined. So we're going to look at Turkey, and the idea is to look at the impact of public spending on early childhood education, so childcare services, and the simultaneous impacts of that spending on time allocation and time and income poverty, right? So we have employment effects, income and time, right? Job recipients' income will go up, but also time deficits, right? All else equal. Access to care services will have time effects, right? So there'll be time deficits reduced for some people. So the total income, the total impact will be an increase in income, but like I said, the impact on time deficits is not exactly clear ahead of time. So why Turkey? Well, there's high unemployment and large gender gaps in labor force participation in unpaid work, right? Which is further aggravated by the pandemic and an underdeveloped social care sector. So where best to allocate fiscal stimulus spending, right? So breezing through the data and methodology. So the the pieces of the data that we need are the input-output table for Turkey, and that's for 2012. What we do with that, or what I should say Kijong did with that, was to create a synthetic sector for early childhood education, right? And so that can give us direct and indirect employment effects, right? So through the direct effect of the spending, plus also the backward and forward linkages due to that spending. So then we can look at the distributional outcome through employment and income generation by assigning the new jobs, right, so through a micro simulation. And then we look at the impact of access to early childhood education services on unpaid work time in the household. And then we put that all together. And so the base data set is a synthetic data set, a matched data set of the time use survey for 2015 and the SILK for 2015 for Turkey. And so we're going to look at time deficits and limited poverty rates before and after the policy. So quickly, very quickly, the micro simulation involves assigning the newly created jobs, and there's a whole process of doing that, which I'd be happy to elaborate in questions and answer. Estimating the impact of childcare services on time use, estimate the changes in time use due to new employment distribution, and then analyze the impact of each on time and income poverty. So we define time poverty as having a time deficit, which means from the 168 hours per week, when you subtract the minimum time for personal care, the time spent on required household production, the time spent on income generating activities, including commuting. If that's all more than 168 hours, you have a time deficit. We add those up for the household and adjust the official poverty line by that amount times a replacement rate, which is a domestic wage. So I know I'm going really quickly, but I'm over time already. So just the jobs by gender and previous labor market status. The key here is that there are more. Most of the jobs go to women. Most of them were homemakers before, and so something like 40% of all the jobs are indirect. So 60% are direct. So that's where most of the employment for women is coming from. The required increase in spending is about 1.8% of GDP. That's basically, creating spaces for 3.27 million children. So that's really quick. And so Ípek, I'll hand it over to you. I'm sorry I took so long.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So going on to distribution of the newly generated jobs through social care spending by education level, what we see, if you look on the far right side, is that in terms of the total of approximately 1 million jobs, a little bit over 1 million jobs, around 60% go to college educated workers. This bias for higher education in terms of the allocation of new jobs is particularly pronounced in the case of women, where out of the, again, approximately 600,000 jobs, as 60% of the total jobs go to women, out of the 600,000 jobs into which women are employed, about 500,000 are college educated. It is the reverse case for men, where more than 50% of the newly educated men, newly employed men have lower education, middle school or lower education, and the college educated make up only about 25% of the new employment for men. This is a result that derives from the specifics of our policy design, whereby in deriving the direct job creation in the childcare services sector, we abided by the national legislation, which specifies the skills requirements of teachers and teacher assistants as being college educated and high school educated. So in the case of women, when we did when we distributed the jobs through the micro simulation, predominantly the women were employed into direct jobs in the childcare services sector, and men were predominantly employed into what we call the indirect jobs that are the jobs that are created in sectors other than childcare services through backward linkages. So therefore, we have this asymmetrical situation in terms of distribution of jobs by gender and education. The next slide, please. This leads to an outcome in terms of the gender earnings gap, where we compare the gap amongst the newly employed men and women to that in the baseline, which is the current one that we observe in the survey on income and living conditions. So for each education group, first of all, the gender wage gap seems to have narrowed down, well, other than the high school educated have the least of a change. But in terms of college educated workers, the newly employed women and men have a gender wage gap that actually turns to the favor of women. And in terms of the lower educated group, middle school or less, the gender wage gap is almost eliminated, with women among the new job recipients earning on par with men, as compared to a very high gender wage gap in the current situation in the baseline of 32%. This is again an outcome driving from the specifics of our policy design, where we assume that the newly created jobs in the childcare services sector would have decent wages and social security coverage. So implicit with an assumption of public provisioning of childcare services. And also a combined result of most of the women in the simulation being hired into these direct jobs in the care services sector, whereas men being hired into the indirect jobs in the other sectors. The policy simulation didn't make any interventions in terms of the number of, in terms of the levels of wages or the work hours. They just basically imitated the current observed labor market patterns. Next slide, please. Okay, so coming to one of the unique findings of this paper, the impact of our two-pronged policy intervention on unpaid work. We looked at the impact separately. First of all, how did new employment creation impact unpaid work, and then how the simultaneous access to childcare services changed that outcome on unpaid work. So we're looking at required hours of household production, which is the factor R in the LIMTIP equation that Tom just went over. So this is the time required for household production that is determined by characteristics of the household, such as how many working age adults versus how many children versus how many elderly people needing care. And also alpha IJ, which is the share of each individual, each woman or man in the household in total household production. So in simulating the employment effect on unpaid work, we assume that there would be no impact on the household production threshold on R, but the main impact would be on alpha, the share of the individual in total household production, particularly in the case of women being employed into new jobs. We looked at how much of that unpaid work they would transfer to other members of the household. And in terms of the childcare services effect, we assume that the impact of having access to childcare services actually would bring down R, would have an impact on the household production threshold. So when we look at the outcomes in terms of all job recipients, what we find is that, first of all, in the case of women, there's a decrease with employment into new jobs from approximately 39 hours of unpaid work per week to 37 hours. So there's some impact of employment with women giving out some of their, allocated some of the unpaid work burden to other members of the household, but we find it to be quite minimal. The real impact comes with access to childcare services when there's a further decrease to 30 hours per week. This impact is much more pronounced in the case of job recipients living in households with young children, with employment. In the case of women, the weekly unpaid work goes down from 47 hours in the baseline to 44 hours with allocation of unpaid work to other household members. And then with further access to childcare services, there's a further reduction to 29 hours. So from 39 to 30, approximately a 25% decrease, and then from 47 to 29 hours per week with for women with small children, almost a 40% decrease in unpaid work. Next slide, please.
What about
okay, so is it almost time, Abena? Yes, okay. This is
discussion time.
Yeah, well, this is one of my last two slides. The impact on poverty, we distinguish by official poverty, which is income poverty, versus limited poverty, which also takes into account time deficits and lack of time for household production. So first of all, as you can see, the official poverty rates, which we see on the left-hand side, the official poverty rate for women in job recipient households is in the baseline quite low at 3%. The overall for Turkey, the official poverty rate is 16%. So women's poverty rate in our simulation, the affected women who are hired into the new jobs with small children, it's pretty low because it was mostly women with college education who were hired into these childcare services jobs. In the case of men, where the employable pool was more predominated by men with lower skills and lower education and coming from lower income households, the official poverty rate is much higher at 31%. But the point here is how the two policy interventions, first, the job creation and providing women and men with access to new jobs, employing them into new jobs, and how then the incremental policy of also providing these women and men living in households with young children, also with access to care services, how the impact on official poverty versus limited poverty, which also takes into account time deficits and shortages in household production, how there's a difference between them and how there's a gender difference between them. So looking at the official poverty, it looks like as if with employment and employing women into new jobs and increasing their household income, official poverty is almost eliminated amongst the household recipients. For men, there's a substantial drop by about 7 percentage points. In the case of limited poverty, when we also take into consideration the time deficits, what we find is actually employment into new jobs increases women's limited poverty from 8% to 12%, almost by 1/3. But then when we also provide women who are employed into these new jobs with access to childcare services, the limited poverty, the combined income and time poverty, decreases substantially down to 4%. In the case of men, there's a unilateral directional change with both employment and access to childcare services decreasing their limited poverty. So next slide, please. So to conclude, first, social care spending facilitates a substantial generation of new employment, particularly for women, and leads to narrowing of the gender gaps in employment and wages while decreasing income poverty, both for women and men. Access to jobs alone increases mothers' time poverty, or women living in households with small children. It increases their time poverty and their limited poverty, which means that actually the empirical question of the negative time effects versus the positive income effects, so providing only new jobs, the negative time effects outweigh the positive income effects of employment. But when we add on to it a simultaneous access to social care services, both time poverty and limited poverty rates are reduced, particularly for women, or in other words, the positive time effects of childcare services and income effects of employment outweigh the negative time effects of employment. And finally, because of limitations of time, we didn't show the results on time poverty, but what we find is that even after providing access to childcare services, about 1/3 of the new job recipient women with small children continue to remain in time poverty, which means that access to services by themselves is not sufficient enough to eliminate time poverty for employed women with small children. Thank you. And sorry for going over our time.
Well, literally, we've just got like 1 minute and 22 seconds for questions and answers. Okay, I see a question. Is it possible to include LTC in the evaluation of limb-tip poverty?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, in our case, the simulation was focused predominantly on childcare services for the case of Turkey, because this is where most of the policy discussion has revolved around in the past decade. But there's more and more talk of elderly care also becoming an issue. And maybe Tom may also comment because they've done some simulations for other countries. And I don't know if elderly care was ever a part of it in terms of limb-tip. I guess not, always childcare. But yes, and I think that also points in the direction of some future work.
Yeah. And what do you think about Erica's question, Ípek, for employment for lower educated women, less educated women?
Okay, thank you. We've run out of time for this session. There will be a little bit of time right at the end so we can come back. So I would like to invite Pallavi to make her presentation.
You can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Thank you, Abena, for organizing the session, and I'm glad to be a part of the IFFE panel, and I thank you for the opportunity. So I am going to present my paper on the linkages between infrastructure and child health outcomes in India today. So the paper is titled Roads to Better Health, Infrastructure and Child Health Outcomes in India. Infrastructure, I'll be focusing on road building in India. And in terms of child health outcomes, I'll be looking at infant and neonatal mortality and effect on son preference in India. So this is no surprise that lack of access to the nearest market or health center significantly constrains people's economic and social opportunities. This is something that has been said in the literature for quite some time. And India is a special region where in 2000, 40% of villages in India lacked an all-weather road. Since there was a lack of access, we know that lack of access can create problems. And on the other hand, access to transportation infrastructure can have many positive ripple effects in the economy. So it can affect labor force participation rates, it can affect incomes, it can create better access to a variety of goods in the market, can affect international trade, so on and so forth, that can bring some positive gains to the society. And on the other hand, it is possible that road infrastructure can create pollution. So as you're building road, that increases pollution and that may affect health, or it can increase inequality in the system. So given that there are these different ways through which road can affect these different mechanisms, the idea that this paper wants to look at is how does all of that contribute to a change in health of the population. Now, empirically, it is difficult to establish causality as road placement is likely to be endogenous. Road placement is not something that is random. And what we see is generally there is a need-based allocation. So areas that need more roads get more roads. And so in that kind of a scenario, it is difficult to say that whether the road building led to any changes in outcome. So not only static, we also see that there could be dynamic or time varying factors which may affect road building. And so therefore, for example, if we expect a city to develop over time, maybe we want to give that city better roads so that it can develop more fully. So it can be path dependent. So literature to overcome this problem of endogeneity uses instruments based on historical routes or from calculating straight line distance. However, there have been studies which have shown that there is path dependence in infrastructure building. So for example, the railways that were constructed historically may have led to development of cities in a different way. And so these cities then get roads, so there is this path dependence. So therefore, I abstract from using instrument and I instead use a quasi-random experiment of the rollout of the roads in a scheme which was implemented throughout India. So this was called the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, PMGSY for short. And I am going to look at the impact of differential access of these roads by different villages at different points in time. So this was a rural road building scheme. And when we look at the literature, the link between rural roads and health has been specified and has been looked at. So one, what it can do is it can increase the use of formal health care. So people did not have access to healthcare by building road. You can visit that hospital and that is going to increase health. There are studies which have shown that it can increase household per capita income and consumption, so it reduces the constraints for the household, and that is something that may improve health. There is another strand of literature which looks at community infrastructure like access to electricity or improved sanitation and public health expenditure that can affect child mortality. For this particular program, the PMGSY, there have been some recent studies which have looked at the impact of this road building scheme on differential outcomes. So one paper by Aduke et al. That just came out looks at the effect of PMGSY on education of children, and they find there is a positive impact on education. However, on the other hand, this paper by Asher and Novosad see no major changes in agricultural outcomes, incomes, or assets of people living in those villages. So there are some educational effects, there are some effects on schooling decisions, on consumption, but on the other hand, we do not see effects on agriculture outcomes, incomes, or assets. So this paper kind of takes this forward to look at the health outcomes and how it estimates the effect of being exposed to road construction on these infant and neonatal mortality is by developing a unique matched micropanel data set on both health outcomes and road construction in India. So I'm going to discuss that a little bit in a few minutes. It uses two strategies to develop a causal impact. It uses a district level household survey, DLHS-3, which was carried out in 2007-8, to look at the within mother variation in survival of infant. And the next strategy that it uses is a fuzzy regression discontinuity design. And I'm going to talk in a minute why I can use a fuzzy RDD in this paper. So a little bit background on the program. So this program, PMGSY, was launched by the government of India in 2000 to provide all-weather access to any unconnected habitation. So it was building of new roads, but it was also repavement of roads. However, the new roads had more priority, so those things started before the repavement of roads. And how this was carried out and what gives me this variation is that we have the cutoff in terms of the population of the village that determines when the village is going to get the road. So all unconnected habitations with a population of 1,000 people and above were covered in the first 3 years. So it was started in 2000, and first the villages above 1,000 people got the roads, and then it was population of 500 people or above that got the road. So where is this population data coming from? The population data comes from the 2001 census population that India carried out, and that was used as the eligibility for the program. So given these different cutoffs, I can use that to look at villages just above and below the cutoff to use the fuzzy RDD design. So data, the road building data is something that comes from the Online Management and Monitoring System, the OMMS. The government kept a detailed record on how and when the roads were built. So we have data on roads built, habitations affected each year, baseline habitation connectivity status, when was the road sanctioned, what was the population, and when was the road completed. So data here is reported at the habitation level or the road level, so which is a minute place, so whether the road outside is going to get built. The other part comes from the health data. So this is from the district level household survey. Now roads are being built at the village level. However, India does not have an all India health survey that has village identifiers. So DLHS is a survey which collects data at the village level, but does not have the village identifiers, and we have district level identifiers. So this is something that was conducted in 7 and 8. And what I use is I look at the fertility history of women. So women of reproductive age between 15 to 49 years are interviewed about the date of birth and death during the last 3 years of the survey date. So I can see the same woman over a period of time if she has given multiple births, and I can then compare she giving birth after the road building vis-a-vis before the road building to see the causal outcome. Now, since this does not have village identifier, and by aggregating it to district, we may lose some variation. What I do is I look at the village questionnaire in the district level household survey, and using the population, it has the 2001 census population, the same population that PMGSY data used. And using that, I match these two data sets. So I am, at this point, I should say, I'm extremely grateful to Paul Novosad and Sam Asher for sharing this matching data from PMGSY and census with me. So after I match these two data sets, I see that 81% of the villages interviewed in DLHS3 are being matched to the PMGSY data set. Dropping data for children born within 12 months of survey, so that to remove any measurement error, I see that the sample includes about 151,000 children born to about 123,000 mothers. So as I mentioned, I use two strategies. So first is the linear probability model. And what I look at is the household experience of child death. So IMR is infant mortality. Similarly, I have neonatal mortality. And so this is a child I born to mother M in village V at time T. So does a child who is born to mother M in village V at time T die before reaching the age of 1 year, or if it's neonatal, before reaching the age of 1 month? What I'm interested in is the effect of the road building, so which is the treatment, which is something that takes the value of 1 if the village had a road constructed under PMGSY at that particular time T. I have a bunch of control. So I control for sex of the children, whether they are born in multiple birth, what is their birth order, because that has been shown to be significant in the Indian economics literature, mother's age at birth, birth month, so on and so forth. And to alleviate any concerns of the placement of the road, since I am controlling for the mother, I am looking at the differences within the household. I am able to control for any unobservable time invariant effects. Then I have normal time trends, and I have district time trends. And lastly, I also have sex ratio, which is the preference for a mother to have a son. So whether there is a son that is born. Okay, since I am running out of time, I'll quickly pass through this. So fuzzy RDD. So why this may be better is even if selection into PMGSY is based on political or economic factors, they should not change discontinuously at a random cutoff of 500 or 1,000. And so that is something that may help identify the effect. So I think we know that when we are doing a fuzzy RD, the discontinuity becomes like an instrumental variable. And I use a fuzzy RD because what you plan in terms of road placement will not be exactly how the road placement will be. So there is some give in the model. So I'm going to skip this. I'm going to go to the results. So the first, I present the OLS results, and what we see is that the building of road does not have any statistically significant impact on either infant or neonatal mortality. So I try different specification. Column 3 and column 6 are the most stringent specifications, and we do not see any impact. So then the first question that should come to mind is maybe the road building was not as per plan. And this is something that corruption or something that led to not seeing the jump in building of roads. So to alleviate those concerns, I see whether actually at the cutoffs of 500 and 1,000, there is a change in the probability of a village getting a road. And I definitely see a big jump in both of these scenarios. So it's not that roads were not being built, it's that we are not seeing the effects on the health outcomes. Since this is fuzzy RD, there may be a concern that people may be gaming the cutoffs, or villages may be gaming the cutoff, saying that we have a population of 500 to get that road. However, I do not see any bunching on these two levels, alleviating any of these concerns. And therefore, I present the first stage results. I see that the cutoffs are important, are strong instruments to look at the effect of road building on health outcomes. However, when I go to infant and neonatal mortality, I see some jumps, but these are not big jumps. And that is something that is confirmed when I look at the point estimates from the fuzzy RD specifications. So across the specification, barring a random star, I see no effects on both infant and neonatal mortality, even using the fuzzy RD design. Lastly, sex ratio at birth, just as I do not see impact on infant and neonatal mortality, in both the models, I do not really see any impact or changes in son preference for these households. So I'll conclude that overall, using this unique micro data set, having village level health and road data, I do not find any significant impact. So there could be multiple things that are going on. One, it is possible that this is a short-term estimation of the effect. So road has just been built, and that is something that we are not able to capture and see the effect in the long run. Another possibility is that there are positive and negative channels that are going on at the same time, and that may be canceling each other out at the aggregate effect. And so that is possible because we saw that the paper by Novosad and Asher showed that there was no effect on income, etc. However, there were some effects on schooling and consumption. So there are multiple things that are going on, and we do not see that in health. And lastly, something to ponder about is whether the access to healthcare or markets necessarily imply a change in health behavior. So there is a huge literature in health economics which says that it is not only public provision of the good that is important, but rather what is the quality of the good and changing of healthcare behavior of people. And so if we are not able to do that, just providing access to healthcare may not lead to a change in the behavior and health outcomes for the population. So I'll stop here. Thank you for your time. The paper is on the Assa website if you want to look at it in further detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pallavi. So we now have 4 minutes for any questions and comments. If you have any questions, please put them into the question and answer box. or into the chat. Okay, if we are still thinking about questions, because of our time limitations, maybe I can invite Smriti.
Sounds good, thank you. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen. Maybe you want to put it on slideshow.
Yep.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to present at this session today. I'm interested in looking at economic activities of people with disabilities, and today's presentation particular focus on gender differences that we might see. So the first question that I want to look at is how does disability and various economic activities that people can do, how are they related? So World Health Organization estimates that there are around 1 billion people with some kind of disability around the world, and 82% of these people live in developing countries, which is a fairly big number, over 800 million. However, we do not know much about their economic lives. And this is particularly because of the lack of data from developing countries. And recently there has been an extra push to include some disability questionnaire in existing surveys so that we can get at some research on this topic. So recent research that focus on this topic usually only study the effect on general labor market participation and if they do participate on hours worked. However, in the context of developing countries, it might be interesting to look at more disaggregated type of work that people do, because usually people are engaged in more than one kind of work in more than one kind of industry. For example, own agricultural work or own non-agricultural work, or sell their labor. And I thought it would be also interesting to look at some household work, but with the data that I'm using, I only have access to whether they collect water and fuel or not. So I am going to include that in my work. More importantly, I'm also interested in gender differences in the relationship between disability and economic activities. Here I'm looking at differences between males and females. To the best of my knowledge, there is no literature on this, particularly based on developing countries. And what we do know is that women make up a higher portion of people with disabilities around the world, and women with disabilities are more likely to be poor than men with disabilities, which makes it even more important to do such a study in terms of understanding economic activities by gender. And lastly, I also would like to look at how having people with disabilities in the household alters economic activities of others in the household. And again, to the best of my knowledge, I am unaware of any literature that exists on this topic. The data that I'd be using is the LSMS data from Ethiopia, and particularly because it is a panel data that is collected fairly closely between 2011 and 2016. It's nationally representative, and it collects information on disability as well as various economic activities that I'm interested in. LSMS is a fairly big data with tons of modules, so having a very detailed questionnaire on disability is not possible. So what they do is put in what is called the Washington Group short set of questions that asks individuals above the age of 5 whether they are facing any difficulty in 6 dimensions that are listed here. And I identify a person with disability based on their answer as a yes to any of these questions. So if you're disabled, if you answered yes to any of these questions. Now I'm going to look at some of the econometric strategies that I'm using to answer these questions that I listed earlier. The first one, I want to look at the relationship between disability and various economic activities. And the recent studies that have been doing work on this, they use split first difference model, which is what I will be using. And basically what this is you first difference across waves, which gives you a change in disability as your main independent variable, which can further be split, that is, into two separate regressions. One where your main independent variable is onset of disability, and the next one where your independent variable is recovery from disability. The motivation for this split is if you don't, then you're capturing perhaps the opposing effects of these two on your dependent variable. So for example, onset of disability is usually expected to reduce participation in labor market, whereas recovery from disability is expected to increase participation in the labor market. However, if you combine them and don't distinguish them, you may end up with an average effect that is no effect because they canceled each other out. However, because we're first differencing across waves, the mean dependent variables that I'm using, which are binary, also need to be divided further. So, for example, participation in own agriculture would be divided into entry into own agriculture and exit out of own agriculture. So as a result of this first differencing and splitting, what you end up with is 4 separate regressions: entry into own agriculture on onset, entry into own agriculture on recovery, and exit out of own agriculture on onset, and exit out of own agriculture on recovery. I also include a vector of individual, household, community level characteristics to control for any other effect on other variables that may have effect on participation in various economic activities. And in this to answer this particular question, I'm interested in the estimate of beta 1, which gives me the difference between having, an onset of disability to not having an onset of disability, for example. For the second question, where I'm interested in looking at the differences in how disability and economic activities interact based on gender, I expand the model that I just described by including an interaction term between two binary variables. One is change in disability, and one is an identifier for a woman versus a man. So here I'm interested in the estimate for beta 3, which tells me the difference in the likelihood of participating in certain economic activities between women with disability and men with disability, or women who have onset of disability and men who have onset of disability. And lastly, for the other members of the household that have people with disabilities in them, what I do is look at it in a household level, where I am the main independent variable is whether or not you have an individual, say, who has a change in disability, and the main dependent variables for this is average hours worked by other individuals, and I divide it by gender as well. So how much women work, other women who are not a person with disability, and other men as well. So in this regression, what I am interested in is beta 1, estimate of beta 1, which gives me the difference between average hours worked by, say, women in the household that have someone who has a changing disability status to other women in households that do not have individuals going through a change in disability. Again, I'm interested in the estimates of beta 1, beta 3, and beta 1 respectively in these 3 questions, as is highlighted in bold. So going through results, I'm going to present results by type of economic activity. So the first one is economic activity for own participation in own agriculture. And because of time, I'm going to only present some significant results. And what I would like to first start with is each of these cells represent a separate regression analysis. And so here you see Q1 is the regressions for the question number 1 that I had earlier presented, and question number 2 is for the second question where I'm interested in gender differences. So here we see that women who recover are less likely to begin participation in own agriculture than men who recover from a disability. And for the third question, I have a separate table right under here where I find that women who are in households that have individuals with onset of disability have a higher change in average hours worked in own agriculture. And same is true for the men who live in households with individuals that are going through onset of disability. I'll talk about what this means in my conclusion. Just want to go through results first. Now I'm going to present on own non-agricultural work. Again, a similar table. Here, what I find is women who are going through onset of disability are more likely to begin participation in own non-agricultural work than men who are going through onset of disability. And women in households that have individuals going through onset of disability have a higher change in average hours worked in non-agriculture as well. And again, reminding you that these are women, average women's hours, excluding the person with disability, if there are women. On wage labor, I find that recovery, women who go through recovery are more likely to stop participating in wage labor versus men who recover. And in both types of changes in disability status, women on both sides see a lower change in average hours worked in wage labor. No changes in, no particular differences in men's average hours in both kind of disability change. And lastly, for water and fuel collection, I find that a person who recovers from disability is less likely to begin participating in water and fuel collection. However, if the recovery is among women, they are more likely to begin participation in water and fuel collection than men who recover, which is not surprising. And lastly, other women in households step up also, as you can see that they have a higher change in average hours worked, average hours put in for water and fuel collection in comparison to women who do not have anybody in the household that are going through onset of disability. Whereas in recovery, we do not see an increase, we actually see a decrease in average hours, or we see that women and men both have a lower changes in average hours put in water and fuel collection in comparison to their counterparts in households that do not have someone going through recovery. Sorry, it's a mouthful, this one. Lastly, to conclude, so there is a particular thing that is interesting here, that what we expect to happen is not what we see in data, especially when you disaggregate across various economic activities. The expectation generally is onset leads to lower participation in the labor market, and recovery leads to higher. However, in most cases, I find that there is no correlation at all. And in some cases, I find that if you look at it from different gender perspective, you see that women are more likely to actually engage in non-agricultural work, even when they're going through onset of disability. Whereas in other side, recovery may not always mean that there's going to be increase in labor market. If you look at it from a disaggregate perspective, it seems that recovery from a disability led to wanting to stop working in wage labor and wanting to not begin agricultural work. However, there is one way to justify this is most of the sample that I have, they have moderate severity, which means that maybe in rural contexts that I'm looking at, individuals don't change their participation because of mild problems, because they're used to having problems. So I do work also to look at the effects by severity, but I'm not presenting it based on time. And there is some truth to the fact that mild versus severe disability may have different relationships. There are some differences between women with disability and men with disability. Particularly of interest is the role of non-agricultural enterprises, in which women with disability seem to want to engage more in. This may have some policy implications, and I need to do further research on this aspect. And lastly, onset of disability, which can be considered as a negative health shock in the household. Other women members especially, step up and seem to adjust their hours so that they can make up for any time lost or help the person who has disability. Men also do just in agriculture, whereas women do this in almost every type of work that have flexibility. So own agricultural work, own non-agricultural work, as well as household work, women seem to be increasing. Women seem to have a higher change in hours, indicating that they are more likely to adjust. Whereas when there is recovery from disability, which can be understood as a positive health shock, that does not elicit as much change in other household members. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Smriti. So for this presentation, we have, let's say, just under 5 minutes for questions and answers. If you would like to put in the chat box, well, question and answer box, not the chat box. Or else if fellow presenters have any questions they would like to ask. Yes, Bina?
You're muted.
Please unmute yourself. Bina, please unmute yourself. Oh.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I had a question. You haven't brought in, Smriti, I was wondering whether you would looked at children in this context, because they would clearly be quite primary if people have disabilities. And I also had a question for Pallavi, but I couldn't unmute myself, which was, if I may ask that here, is did you bring in regional differences in your analysis? Because for all the other variables that you bring in, whether it's sex ratio and so on, there are strong regional differences across India, and there's a way to build that in. Thank you.
I can answer my question first. So I did look at whether other members, I divided them further into children below age of 15 and by also gender, and it didn't seem like there was any added burden on children with having a person with disability in the household. So I just let it be with full women and men distinction only. Is that what
Well, you know, if you have more girl children, it would make a difference in terms of the mother than if you have boy children, both in terms of your agriculture and non-agriculture. So the boy may go to the field, but the girl children would help much more in the non-farm work or in the other subsistence activities, water fetching, firewood, and so on. So in a way, I would really expect much more of an impact.
Okay,
and if it
I'll check that. Thank you.
Any more questions for Smriti before we turn to Pallavi? Well, maybe I'll take advantage of being the chair. I just have a question. How did you measure the onset of the disability and recovery?
So when you take the first difference of disability, the change in disability will take on values of -1, 0, and 1. And so onset is basically if an individual did not have disability in wave 1, but ends up having disability in wave 2, they're considered having onset of disability, while someone who had disability in wave 1 and does not have disability in wave 2 becomes someone who recovers from disability. And there is quite a variation in terms of how people come in and out of disability. So there is variation in that and by gender as well. So both male and female are going through changes.
So the same thinking also affected entry into agriculture and export.
Exactly. That was just a means to an end, because the previous literature, they are very, very focused, and they insist that we separate onset and recovery. And if we do that, we also have to separate. Otherwise, modeling it will be kind of hard. Thank you.
So I don't see anything in the question and answer box for now. So Pallavi, would you like to respond to Bina's question?
Yes, thank you, Abena. And thank you, Bina, for your comment. And I agree that that is something that is going to be important. In fact, I am looking at the heterogeneity analysis as of now. So that was not a part of the paper as of now. But there are anecdotal evidence that PMGSY was kind of successful more in certain states vis-a-vis certain others. So maybe there is a dimension there. However, when I'm looking at the fuzzy RD, I'm comparing villages. And so I am having the district time trends and everything. So that is kind of controlled for when I look at that. But I'm going to disaggregate the data by this dimension and look at the regional heterogeneity. Yeah.
There's, if I may, Abena, just a follow up. You know, you brought in politics into it, but is it worth looking at opposition parties versus the ruling party? Because that would introduce an element of endogeneity in terms of where the schemes are implemented and where they are not.
Right. So when we look at the implementation, so this was something that was signed at the central level, and that is how it was followed in terms of implementation. So state did not have a lot of say in it, but it is also true that different states started at different points in terms of access to roads. And so that is something that may create that kind of heterogeneity and stuff. And we know that sun preference and all of this thing is very regional in India. So I am thinking that the aggregate is masking some of these effects. Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, we still have 12 minutes to go for our session. Do we have am I missing any raised hands amongst the attendees? No.
If I have a minute, I mean, if nobody else is asking, I wanted to come back to Smriti's question to me. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the striking features of these results that widows are the ones who inherit is that the studies actually look at married women. So there's an assumption that if you're married and you're a young mother, you're going to participate in decision making, and therefore it'll make a difference to the child's welfare, nutrition, or health outcomes or educational outcomes. Whereas if you're inheriting, in this case, as 50 plus widows past the reproductive age, in fact, it obfuscates the need for that kind of, it wouldn't come into your hypothesis at all. And similarly, the study where it says there's pressure on the woman by her husband to, and that leads to suicide, would again not be something that would come into the domain because you're not inheriting at that level. So I think bringing in this dimension actually helps us be much more critical of the hypotheses that we're testing, at least in the Indian context. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't be relevant for other contexts.
Any more observations? Okay, so would our presenters want to have any final words, since we do have a few more minutes?
Well, if I may to talk a little bit, it is really interesting what Professor Bina was telling us, because in Colombia we found evidence of something, I don't know if similar, but it is related. In Colombia, women who wants to belong to the National Association of Agricultural Product Producers need to have, they need to own the land, and they need to provide evidence that they are the owners of the land they are cultivating. So they have started a kind of negotiations and bargainings in their households with their husbands. And we have found evidence that at the beginning, the land is a property of the man, of the husband in the household. And then women bargain with them to have a small portion of the land. And there, in this place, they can start to cultivate and start to have their own crops. And when this business start to be successful, husbands took them out the land. I mean, they reclaim the property of this land, and women have to give back the land that husbands have gave them initially. So here we have a really interesting processes of bargainings inside within the household, and we have like this kind of negotiations about who is the owner of the land and how decisions about land property should be made in the household. So it's really interesting to know that in India we have like this kind of similar dynamics about inheriting lands.
Yeah. This is interesting. There are a number of initiatives where women are leasing in land. So that would probably possibly be an option, that if you don't own it, you don't have to depend on your husband. And this is group farming. They lease in land in groups and cultivate it. It's something I've been working on for many years now, and have found that the productivity of the group farms, all women group farms, is higher than the individual family farms, which are usually male managed. So there are many ways by which you could actually access land if you're not looking only for ownership.
Yeah.
I see Cheryl is in the participant list, but she hasn't asked any questions. So I'm just curious if she had any. We still have time. Ípek, I wasn't, you have three questions in the Q&A. There's questions in the Q&A.
Yes, I answered. Can everybody see? I answered Erica's question in writing. Well, just to comment on that, I think it's a good question. In the Turkish context, we used the national legislation on childcare services, which actually requires employees to have high qualifications, minimum high school education for teacher assistants and college education for teachers. So inevitably that led to a situation where the outcomes were quite positive on the gender equality side, but not so positive in terms of socioeconomic equality amongst women. It was a policy option that ended up favoring higher educated women that come from higher income households, as Erika has observed in her question. Of course, it is possible to add more elements to the particulars of the policy design, whereby the lower skilled women with lower levels of schooling are given some training and with skills upgrading, which is actually something on the feminist agenda as well, skills upgrading in the care sector, in the care services sector. And through that skills upgrading, it also becomes possible for women coming from lower income households with lower skills actually to be hired into the new jobs. And that could be also built into the costing part, where in the current costing, we do not really consider any training and skills upgrading types of programs. We just consider the opening of new childcare centers and just hiring of personnel. Nothing beyond that.
Ípek, I missed it because there was very rich presentation. Did you actually add time poverty and income poverty, or did you allow for different directions, because they could go in different directions?
Yes, we did add time poverty and income poverty. Because of limitations of time, we didn't show the results directly on time poverty. We just ended up showing the combined LINTIP poverty, which brings time and income components together. In terms of time poverty, what we found is that actually being hired into new jobs by itself without providing women with childcare services leads to a substantial increase in time poverty of women, which is a common finding from LIMTIP studies by Tom and Ajit and other colleagues at the Levy Institute. The novelty of this new study on Turkey is that we question, what if the women with small children who are now hired into these new jobs are also simultaneously given access to childcare services? Then what we find is that with simultaneous policy intervention, giving new jobs and at the same time providing services, the time poverty rates are reduced by more than 50%. But still, we have a substantial number, about 1/3 of women employed into the new jobs and whose children are placed in the new childcare centers. About 1/3 still remain in time poverty. So that was also a striking finding. I mean, the 50% reduction comes from a very high time poverty rate.
Great. Thank you.
I will have to come in here. We've got like 3 minutes and then we get automatically cut off. And so I would like to thank the presenters and for the interesting presentation and for the participants for being here and listening. And since we don't want to be rudely cut off, I would like to say bye-bye and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Abena.
you all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Very
Abena,
nice seeing
for
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to
Safe,
meet you.
have a good year.
Yes, Happy New Year also. Bye.
Yeah.
Well, thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.